Buried under the streets of several Southern California communities, thin strands of fiber optic cable that were never designed to detect earthquakes have just picked up something seismologists say they've never recorded before. Not a rupture, not an aftershock. A signal, subtle, sustained, and coming from a section of the San Andreas Fault that researchers thought they understood better than almost any other fault segment in the world. What that signal actually represents is still being debated inside the offices of the scientists who found it, but the fact that it exists at all, using a detection method that didn't exist in this form even a decade ago, is what's driving one of the more unusual monitoring alerts to come out of California fault research in years. To understand why this discovery matters, you first need to understand the tool that made it possible, because the tool itself is almost as significant as what it found. For most of the last century, earthquake monitoring relied on seismometers, physical instruments planted at fixed points, expensive to install, limited in number, and only able to tell scientists what was happening at that one specific location. Fiber optic sensing changes that completely. Using a technique called distributed acoustic sensing, researchers can now send laser pulses down ordinary fiber optic cables, the same kind that carry internet traffic under city streets, and measure how those pulses scatter as tiny vibrations disturb the cable along its entire length. Suddenly, a single strand of fiber running for miles becomes thousands of individual seismic sensors, spaced meters apart, all recording continuously. It's the difference between having a handful of microphones scattered across a stadium and wiring the entire building to listen everywhere at once. When researchers repurposed an existing fiber optic network running near a well-studied section of the San Andreas system for exactly this kind of continuous monitoring, they weren't necessarily expecting to find something new. The San Andreas is arguably the most studied fault on the planet. Decades of GPS monitoring, satellite radar, borehole strainmeters, and conventional seismometers have already mapped its behavior in extraordinary detail. But the density and continuity of fiber optic sensing let researchers see something that sparser, traditional instruments had likely been averaging out or missing entirely. A faint, rhythmic pulse of ground motion, far too subtle to register as a felt earthquake, occurring in a pattern researchers say doesn't match any previously cataloged category of fault behavior in that specific location. Here's where it gets genuinely interesting for anyone who follows fault science, because faults don't just fail in one way. Most people picture an earthquake as a single, sudden slip, stress builds for years or centuries, then releases all at once in a rupture that shakes the ground. But researchers have spent the last 2 decades discovering that faults also move in much quieter ways. Slow slip events, sometimes called silent earthquakes, release stress gradually over days or weeks without producing damaging shaking at all. Tectonic tremor, a faint, extended rumble distinct from a normal earthquake's sharp signal, has been documented on some fault systems as evidence of deep, slow movement well below the surface. What the fiber optic array picked up doesn't cleanly match either of those known categories. It's not exactly slow slip behavior as previously cataloged, and it's not quite matching the tremor signatures recorded on other fault systems either. It sits in a gap between known categories, which is exactly why the discovery has generated so much attention inside the research community rather than being quickly filed under an existing label. The location matters enormously here, and it's part of why researchers are being careful about how they characterize what they've found. This section of the San Andreas sits near the boundary between a portion of the fault that's known to creep, meaning it slips gradually and continuously without building up the kind of stress that produces major earthquakes, and a locked segment nearby that hasn't ruptured in a significant way in well over a century and is capable of producing a substantial earthquake when it eventually does. Understanding exactly how these two behaviors, the creeping section and the locked section, interact at their boundary has been one of the central open questions in California seismology for years, because that boundary zone is where stress transfer between a segment that's quietly releasing pressure and one that's storing it up could theoretically influence the timing or size of a future major rupture. A previously undetected signal showing up right in that transition zone is exactly the kind of finding that reshapes how researchers model the boundary's behavior. Researchers are quick to draw a clear line here, because this is the point where public interpretation and scientific interpretation tend to diverge sharply. Finding a new type of signal is not the same as finding evidence of an imminent major earthquake. Seismologists have been explicit that this discovery does not change the fundamental probability estimates already published for a major San Andreas rupture in the coming decades. What it does change is the resolution at which scientists can observe the fault's day-to-day behavior, And resolution matters enormously in a field where the biggest historical failures haven't usually been about missing a warning sign entirely, but about not having instrumentation sensitive enough to have recorded it in the first place. This finding is being treated less as a red flag and more as proof that an entirely new observational window has just opened on a fault segment researchers thought they'd already mapped as thoroughly as current technology allowed. That reframing matters because of what comes next. Now that researchers know this kind of signal exists and know the detection method that can find it, teams are moving quickly to expand fiber optic monitoring coverage along other sections of the San Andreas system and along other major fault systems in the state, specifically to check whether this is a localized quirk of one particular stretch of fault or a widespread behavior that's simply gone undetected everywhere else because nobody had the right kind of sensor listening closely enough. If it turns out to be widespread, it could mean a significant portion of California's fault network has been quietly behaving in ways existing models never accounted for, hidden below the detection threshold of conventional seismometers for the entire history of instrumental earthquake monitoring. There's also a practical advantage to fiber optic monitoring that goes beyond just sensitivity, and it's part of why researchers are so enthusiastic about scaling this approach up quickly. Traditional seismometer networks are expensive to expand. Each new station requires site selection, permitting, physical installation, and ongoing maintenance. Fiber optic sensing can potentially piggyback on telecommunications infrastructure that's already buried across the state, existing internet and telecom cables running beneath streets, along highways, under cities, turning existing infrastructure into a dense seismic network essentially overnight without laying a single new sensor in the ground. For a state with as much underground fiber infrastructure as California already has, and as many overlapping fault systems as it needs to monitor, that's a potentially transformative shift in monitoring capability, not just for the San Andreas specifically, but for earthquake science across the entire region. Scientists studying the new signal are now working through several competing explanations, and being candid that they don't yet have a confident answer. One possibility is that it represents a very small-scale, localized version of slow-slip behavior, essentially the same phenomenon documented elsewhere, just far subtler and more frequent than anything previously cataloged at this specific location. Another possibility under active investigation is that it reflects fluid movement deep within the fault zone itself. Water or other fluids shifting through fractured rock can produce faint, rhythmic seismic signatures that have nothing directly to do with stress accumulation or release, but instead relate to the fault's internal plumbing. A third line of research is examining whether the signal correlates with any external forcing, small tidal stresses, seasonal groundwater changes, or barometric pressure shifts have all been shown on other fault systems to modulate subtle fault behavior in ways that wouldn't be dangerous on their own, but that reveal just how sensitive some sections of a fault can be to forces most people would never associate with earthquake risk at all. Whatever the ultimate explanation turns out to be, researchers are unified on one point. This is exactly the kind of discovery that becomes far more valuable with sustained, long-term monitoring than with a single detection event. A signal recorded once could be an anomaly, an instrument artifact, or a genuinely rare event that happened to occur during the exact window fiber optic sensing was watching. A signal recorded repeatedly, with a consistent pattern across an expanding monitoring network, becomes something researchers can actually build a predictive model around. That's the phase this research has now entered, moving from a single striking detection to the much slower, more rigorous work of determining whether what was found is a one-time curiosity or a genuine, previously invisible feature of how this section of the San Andreas actually behaves. For residents living near this stretch of fault, and for the broader public following California earthquake science generally, the message from researchers has been consistent and deliberately measured. Existing earthquake preparedness guidance hasn't changed, and this finding isn't a countdown to anything specific. What has changed is the depth of observation now possible on one of the most consequential fault systems in the country, and the growing recognition among seismologists that even a fault as intensively studied as the San Andreas may still be holding behaviors that decades of conventional monitoring simply weren't built to catch. In a field where every generation of new instrumentation has historically revealed some layer of fault behavior invisible to the generation before it, this discovery is being treated less as an alarm and more as confirmation that the next generation of earthquake science may look and listen nothing like the one that came before it. The broader scientific response to this finding has moved quickly from a single research team's discovery towards something closer to a coordinated effort. Universities and state geological survey teams that had previously run separate, smaller-scale fiber optic pilot projects along different sections of California's fault network are now comparing notes directly, checking whether any of their own archived data, recorded before anyone knew to look for this specific kind of pattern, might contain the same signal hiding unnoticed in datasets that were originally collected for entirely different purposes. That kind of retroactive reanalysis has become increasingly common in seismology precisely because distributed fiber optic sensing generates such enormous volumes of continuous data that researchers routinely find themselves discovering signals years after the raw recordings were first made, simply because nobody had previously known what pattern to search for. There's an infrastructure angle to this story that hasn't gotten as much attention as the seismology itself, but which state emergency planning officials are watching closely. Telecommunications companies that own and operate the fiber optic networks being repurposed for this kind of monitoring have generally been cooperative with research institutions, recognizing both the scientific value and the potential future application for their own network resilience planning, since understanding ground motion patterns along buried cable routes has obvious value for protecting the infrastructure itself during an actual major earthquake. Some officials have floated the possibility of formal public-private partnerships that would expand this kind of fault monitoring statewide using existing telecom infrastructure as the backbone, a proposal still in early discussion stages, but one that reflects how quickly the practical applications of this technology are being recognized well beyond the research community that first developed it. Seismologists caution against reading too much into how quickly this story has moved from a research finding to broader public and institutional attention, noting that public interest in the San Andreas Fault tends to spike disproportionately relative to the actual scientific significance of any given finding, simply because of how much cultural weight the fault carries as shorthand for California earthquake risk generally. That cultural weight is part of why researchers have been unusually careful in how they've publicly framed this discovery. Repeatedly emphasizing what it doesn't mean alongside what it does, aware that a finding framed loosely as unprecedented risks being misread as an imminent warning rather than what it actually represents. A genuinely new observational capability revealing a genuinely new category of fault behavior that will now take years of sustained study to fully understand. It's worth stepping back to appreciate just how much of earthquake science has historically advanced this exact way, through a new instrument revealing a category of behavior nobody knew to look for, rather than through a dramatic single event. GPS-based fault monitoring, now considered completely standard, only became sensitive enough to detect the slow slip events mentioned earlier a few decades ago, and when it first did, it revealed an entire category of fault motion that earlier generations of seismologists simply had no way to observe. Borehole strainmeters, instruments lowered deep into narrow boreholes to measure minute deformation in surrounding rock, similarly opened up detection capabilities that reshaped how scientists modeled stress accumulation along major faults. Each of these technological leaps followed a similar arc. A new instrument gets deployed, it finds something unexpected, the finding gets treated with appropriate scientific caution, and then years of follow-up research either confirm it as a genuine, previously hidden feature of fault behavior, or reveal it to be an artifact of the measurement technique itself. Fiber optic distributed acoustic sensing is now entering exactly that same arc, and researchers say it's simply too early in that process to know with confidence which outcome this particular signal will turn out to represent. What makes researchers particularly optimistic about this specific technological leap, compared to some previous ones, is the sheer density of data it produces. A borehole strainmeter gives you one exceptionally sensitive measurement point. GPS stations, similarly, are limited by how many can realistically be installed and maintained across a region. Fiber optic sensing, by contrast, can turn a single existing cable route into thousands of measurement points simultaneously, which means researchers aren't just looking for a signal at one location and hoping it repeats, they're watching an entire corridor continuously, increasing the odds that if this behavior is genuinely happening, it will show up again somewhere along the monitored length rather than requiring the same rare set of conditions to align at one specific spot a second time. For now, the research teams involved say the next meaningful update on this story won't come from a single dramatic follow-up finding, but from the slower accumulation of repeated observations across an expanding sensor network, the kind of unglamorous, methodical work that rarely makes headlines on its own, but that determines whether this signal ultimately gets written into the textbooks as a newly confirmed category of fault behavior, or filed away as an unusual but ultimately minor curiosity in the long history of a fault that keeps finding new ways to surprise the people who study it most closely.